Hi, I'm Patricia Robin Woodruff, and I wanted to tell you a bit about the god Zozim. He's known by a bunch of different names, including various names that are like Babilos, Bibilos, Bizburbins, Bubil, that's another one. He's also known as Raguta and Trimpus. The first written mention of the names of Austasia and her partner Babilos is by Jan Lisicky in 1582. However, I believe their worship goes back at least 10,000 years. Babilos is the same god as Zozim. Both names have an onomatopoeic origin, sounding like a bee buzzing. There may be a connection to the Thracian Bulgarian grain god Sabazios, or Sabazios. Regarding the indigenous religion of Lithuania, the 19th century historian Theodore Narbut wrote of Bibilos that he was the god of gingerbreads, beekeepers, healers, brewers, distillers, feasts, and beer. And he added that Lisicky says that the Ruthenians bowed to this god under the name of Zozim. He goes on to describe that Bibilos had altars, statues, temples, priests, and priestesses. He adds that he was also called Trimpus, which he says is not related to Atrimpos, and I haven't found anything to confirm or deny that. And he's also known by the name of Ragutus. Narbut writes, the statue of this god, during his feast falling in February, was transported on a sleigh from village to village. Zozim is worshipped as a god of apiculture, which is raising bees, wax, mead, and revelry and bawdy songs, and possibly a card-playing water spirit. I found mentions of him in the Czech Republic, Ukraine, and Russia, and in Prussia, Latvia, and Lithuania, he is known as Babilos. He is the patron of the drink medvodka, which evolved into mead making. Medvodka is fermented honey that is easier to make to mead, although it does take longer. And it goes back to early pagan times. Zozim is a joyful, fertile, sexual, reveling god. However, Professor William Morrison described him as a corpulent, gluttonous, oversexed, hairy, buzzing spirit whose model may have been the drone bee. The god Zozim would have been very important at one time because the production of wild honey was one of the first major exports of the Slavs. His role of god of beekeepers was taken over in the Middle Ages by the similarly named Saint Zozimus, the patron saint of bees. Saint Zozima has April 30th as his feast day, which is the day before May Day, and it shows up in the pagan sacrifice of tossing a bee comb in a mill stream at midnight of May Day Eve to ensure a plentiful harvest of honey. In the lore of Saint Zozima, he has the power of foretelling as well as healing. And it may well be that Zozim's followers used alcohol or poppy to get into an altered mind state for shamanic traveling and foretelling. Another pagan ritual was recorded under the guise of orthodoxy when, on April 30th, the family would bless their hives. A clean white cloth is spread on the hive, and they set it up as an altar with a candle, bread, salt, and blessed water. The celebrant walks around the hives, holding a lighted candle and sprinkling holy water. The beekeeping season fell between April 30th, May Day Eve, to around the beginning of October, which just so happens to be the feast days of Saint Zozimus and Saint Savity, also known as Saint Sabazios, which bears a striking resemblance to the Thracian sky god Sabazios, who also has a wonderfully buzzy name. So between October 2nd and 10th, beekeepers would get together and celebrate with a bee-themed feast, drinking honey beer, eating bread and honey, having honey cookies, etc. There is also the holiday of Medovy Spas, celebrated on August 1st. This is called Lammas by those in the Celtic faith. Medovy Spas means something like bee divinity or honey savior, and it is clearly a celebration of Zozim and his partner Osteia. This is the first of 3 harvest festivals that take place in August. The first focuses on honey, and the second, on August 11th, focuses on the fruit harvest, especially apples, and the third celebrates grain, bread, and nuts on August 16th. On these sacred days, one must be very careful not to complain, but focus on gratitude and sharing the bounty with those less fortunate. On Medovy Spas, one should eat or bake with honey, and traditional dishes were porridge with honey, bread topped with poppy seeds and honey cakes and buns. This was also the traditional day for making kvass, which is honey beer. It was believed the bees stopped bringing the honey to the hive after this date. It also marked the beginning of the end of summer, as the swallows, sacred to the bird goddess, would fly away. Interesting enough, one form of Zozim's name is bizburbins, which sounds like a bee buzzing, and in Lithuanian, burbti means humming. Another Lithuanian variation is Bibilos, which means water bubble or whirlpool. It would be difficult to decipher which came first, but at some point, Zozim's lore became tangled with that of the water spirits, the Vodunoi. While I haven't found a description of Zozim, there is a description given by Ralston of the Vodunoi as a naked old man with a great paunch and bloated face. He is much given to drinking and delights in carousing and card playing, and is a patron of beekeeping. In ancient times, pagans would make a sacrifice of the first swarm of bees, putting them in a sack and drowning them in the mill pond. I prefer the traditional but less destructive method of tossing a honeycomb into a mill stream, and the mill is considered a sacred spot to the Vodunoi. Zozim's watery duties were also replaced by Saint Zosimus, who was reported to be a Christian alchemist and wrote an essay on the divine water. Consequently, Saint Zosimus, along with Saint Sabazios, became patron saints of the White Sea in Russia. Saint Sabazios is associated with the miracle of creating a well of fresh water. In ancient spells, to negate the drying effects of the evil eye, these saints were called upon. The original version of the spell, probably named Zozim. Rushipedia states, a typical Slavic feast usually began with an offering of medvodka to the gods. Only after that was it possible to eat or drink. Finns in the north considered medvodka a drink with magic powers, and it was believed it could resurrect a person. Zozim and Osteia would preside over wedding festivities, because medvodka is a traditional drink at weddings, and it's the ancient origin of the term honeymoon. Researcher Oleg Dmitriev explains that the bride and groom were supposed to drink weak medvodka for 1 month after their wedding day, and this was supposed to help in the conception of baby boys as the first child. In Russia, the honeymoon was called Medovy Mesats, literally honey month. It may be that the Lithuanian bridal tradition of tossing some mead up into the air was a toast to these celestial deities, the joyful lord and lady of bees. Linden trees would be sacred to Zozim, for they are one of the most favored blossoms for honey production in Ukraine. In spring, a pisanki is usually offered to Zozim under the hives to ensure a good harvest of honey. Icons or carvings of Zozim should be near the hive as well. A beekeeper would first pray to Zozima before beginning his work. There is a saying, greet the bee on Zozimus day, and there will be hives and wax. In the Thracian lore of Sabazios, he doesn't seem to have a seasonal component, but he was seen as mainly a healing deity, and he would do a laying on of hands to heal. It was described as the right hand of the god placed on the belly of the woman would assist in childbirth, and the symbol of the god's hand with 3 fingers outstretched was used for blessing and protection. As Sabazios, his lore was carried on as Saint Sabazios and Saint Sava, and possibly Saint Sinisinius, who heals and protects children from the drying effects of the evil eye. So his healing gesture was the thumb and first 2 fingers upraised, and the ring finger and pinky folded to the palm. This is a gesture of blessing still seen in the Catholic Church today. Numerous existing legends and anecdotes about Saint Sava shows how important viniculture, or raising grapes, was in medieval Serbia. According to them, it was Saint Sava that taught the Serbs how to cultivate vineyards and make wine. One story tells about Saint Sava and the devil planning out the vineyard together, and then they harvested the grapes and put them in the barrel and poured out the wine. In Bulgaria and western Ukraine, more bee rituals were preserved in the worship of Saint Harlampy, who is said to have healed with honey. While his name sounds more like one of Willy Wonka's Oompa Loompas, in Greek it means glowing with joy, which in the lore of Osteia, she is turned into Saint Gobnat, which also means the joyful one. Saint Harlampy's feast day was February 10th, where candles are lit and jars of honey are blessed. And it probably would have been February 2nd, which is the Celestial Cross Quarter Day. But because of the change of the calendars, that moved around. The week before his feast day, it was traditional for beekeeping supplies and beeswax candles to start to be carried on the market. On St. Harlampy's Day, women would bake bread decorated with a cross and a hive or a wreath design, and it was a day off from housework. St. Harlampy's feast day probably ties back to the idea of the thunder candles and Candlemas Day on February 2nd, since beeswax and honey were put in the window to protect against lightning. Honey might also be thrown in the fireplace to turn the cloud, moving the storm elsewhere. The goddess Osteia, in the form of Saint Gobnat, is recorded to have a brother, Saint Abin, who has 2 feast days, March 16th, which is around the spring equinox, and October 27th, which is at the gate of winter. Some scholars suggest this is because there were 2 Saint Abins, but I see it as a seasonal transformation of the god. Saint Abin had power over rivers and seas and has a sacred healing well, around which ribbons were tied to the trees to represent healing petitions. He also healed with a blessed apple. Saint Abin was a very peace-loving saint, and we can presume Saint Zozim was also a joyful, peace-loving god. From the lore passed down in the descriptions of the Vodunoi, we know Zozim also had a love of physical pleasure, enjoying sex, music, good food, and alcoholic drink. Yet he wanted his followers to have that as well, and blesses them with good health, sexual pleasure, joyful inebriation, and delicious foods. Zozim's sacred stone is the amethyst, and the power of the amethyst would help prevent you from becoming drunk. Consequently, the amethyst is listed as February's birthstone in Poland, and sacred to the god of wine. The amethyst is also considered a healing and protective stone. And that's got me wanting some honey.